In this video, we're going to take a look at the new Shape Splatter node. Now, the Shape Splatter is very similar to the Tile Sampler node. So to illustrate this, we're first going to take a look at a setup where we're going to distribute a pattern using Tile Sampler. So here in my scene, you can see that I have the Tile Sampler node, and I have a shape. I have this pyramid shape, and I have this background input, and the pyramid is being set as the pattern here to the Tile Sampler, and I'm just using, again, that purlin noise as the background input. So I can visualize this in the scene. I just create a normal, an AO, and I pipe that here into my base material, and then I just right-click and drag and drop that here into my 3D view, and that's what we're looking at. Now, just to give you some context into how the scene was set up, if we come over here to the 3D view scene, I'm using the plain high res. For the material, we'll go to default, definitions, physically based metal rough, and I'm using the tessellation shader. Let's take a look at the properties on this tessellation. So I'll click edit, and I just want to point out that the scale factor here is set to 100. And so this is the result that you would get when using the Tile Sampler. And again, we have this pyramid shape. Now, this pyramid shape, all of the patterns that we're using, and again, if I look at the Tile Sampler, what I'm using an 8x8 here, every one of the patterns, they all have the same, or it's being displaced by the same height offset value. And if I kind of look at it at this angle, you can see it. Yes, that is the case. They're all the same exact height offset. However, the issue with this using the Tile Sampler is that the pattern that I have here, this pyramid shape, the problem is the pattern is not being placed at different elevations on the background. And so this is kind of this uniform result that we get here. And so that's where the new Shape Splatter is going to come in to save the day. So if we come over here and take a look at our Shape Splatter, again, I have the same kind of setup here. We have our background height, which is that purlin noise, and I'm feeding into it this pattern. And again, I'm creating a normal, ambient occlusion, and outputting that here to the base material so we can visualize this here in our 3D view. So again, right-click this base material, drag and drop it here into my 3D view. Now, this is what you would get using the same setup using the Shape Splatter. The Shape Splatter will distribute patterns on top of a background height while keeping the relative height of each pattern. All the patterns have the same height value, but they're placed at a different elevation on the background. Another thing that I can point out about this here, we'll just come up for more of a top-down view, and you'll notice here that when we take a look at the pattern and the way it's distributed here, the overall volume or aspect ratio of the shape is retained with each of the patterns. Now, another thing that's really important, or I will say fundamental to understand about how this Shape Splatter node is working, is that it's designed to work with a real-world scale. And what I mean by that is the best way to use this height is as a normalized scale. So as I pointed out earlier here with the scene, I'm using this plain high res that we ship with Designer. And this plane is actually 100 units by 100 units. And so again, my material, if we go and edit this, you can see that I set my scale here to be 100 as well. And so what this is going to translate to is when I have a value of white, either 255 or 1.0 in my height map, that means that the white is going to represent 100 units. So just to kind of demonstrate that really quickly on what I'm talking about here, let me come over here to this example. So again, I just have a shape. This is a height map, and I have a normal map that's plugging into a base material. And I'll plug this guy into here. And let me just zoom out a bit. And you can see here that I'm getting this cube shape. Again, I'm using my plane, which is 100 units. And I'm displacing my scale in the shader to be 100 units. And if we look at the shape here, what it's using is just the square pattern with the scale set to 0.99. If I zoom in really close, you can see that that just produces a small black border across here. So what I said before, if we have this white value, and if I hit this info button here and I sample this in my viewport, if I'm looking at my value scale right here, you can see it's 255 or 1. So what this means is that I'm displacing, or my offset is going to be 100 units. And so if my plane is 100 units, so we'll say 100 units in width, and I'm going to displace this guy 100 units in height, I should get what looks like to be, a perfect cube. And that's what we have here, minus a little bit of clipping here in the viewport. But you get the idea of how this scale is being established here in my scene. And like I said, it's just a fundamental thing to understand about the shape node, that it's designed to work with this real-world scale in mind. Okay, so let's drop back over here to our demonstration here. So I'm just going to drag and drop that base material in, and let's take a look at some of the settings that we have here with this shape splatter. So I said early on that the shape splatter it works very much like the tile sampler. So for example, it's going to have several inputs, and these inputs can drive or modulate some of the parameters that you have here for the shape splatter. For example, you have a distribution map. You could input a shape scale, shape rotation, mask random. You could use a vector map, and so on. And like I said, that works similar to how the tile sampler works. You also have the ability to set an X and Y amount. So this is basically going to dictate how many patterns are going to be replicated here within the node. Now, another thing that's very important to understand is that there's been some optimizations here for this shape splatter. So the performance of this node is no longer bound to the number that you have here for this X and Y amount. Now, with the tile sampler, you may have noticed that the higher you set this X and Y amount, the performance may begin to start to drop. However, you will not have that issue with this shape splatter node. So again, like I said, it's not bound, performance is not bound to this X and Y amount. So here, like I said, we have X and Y amount. We also have our pattern and our pattern input. So here, if I switch this to 2, you can see I have a second pattern, which I actually have this hemisphere shape plugged into. And then here in my result, you can see that I now have my pyramid, and then I also have my hemisphere shape here as well. So again, working much like the tile sampler, we have a mode for how that's going to be distributed, pattern index, column, random, and so on. Now, if we look at this, we also have the ability to work with our scale, scale random, and so on. And there's a lot of control that we have here. Now, something else you'll notice that's going to be specific to the shape splatter is this new ratio setting that we'll have. So in this case, it's size ratio from background slope. So the parameter is going to be from background slope, and you'll see this on like size, rotation, height, and so on. So to give you an idea of how this works, let's just scroll down to this height section where we have all these height parameters. And here you can control things like your height offset, height offset random. Notice here that the height scale is set to 1, which means in my case, what I'm doing is I'm driving my actual displacement value based on the unit system that I'm kind of using here. Like I said, for my scale, I have it set to 100, and I know that a value of white, which is going to be this very tip here of this pyramid, is going to displace up 100 units, and then it's going to fall off towards 0 as we get towards black here. Okay, so again, kind of going back here to the settings that we have. Again, I was going to talk about height. Let me scroll down here. Okay, so you have this from background slope, and this one's called skew from background slope. So let me just kind of frame this up so we can get kind of like a side view here. And I want to really focus on some of these pyramid shapes, really. Actually, just so we can really see this, let me scroll back up. Let me switch my pattern input number here to 1. So we're only working with this pyramid shape. Okay, so now we'll again scroll back down, and we'll come over here to height, and you can see that we're going to work with this skew from background slope. So I'm going to start to increase this value. We'll increase it all the way up to 1, and now we can actually skew this pattern shape based on the slope from this height input that's coming in, which in our case, again, like I said, if we look here, that background height input is this purlin noise. So we're skewing the shape based on the slope of this background input. So this here is a really cool setting. Here, I'm going to set this back to 0, and we have another option here, which is conform to background, which is a great setting here. So this just allows us to take our shape, well, again, we'll set this to 1, and allows us to conform the shape to, again, that background slope. Now this is really good for an example, like say that we have a leaf or some sticks, and we want to, replicate those or splatter those across a terrain, an underneath height map of terrain of some type, and we want to be able to conform that so that it follows along with that shape. We can do that using this conform to background option. So we can also, if we take a look at something like our rotation, there's also a from background slope here for our rotation. So again, if we start to increase the slider value here, we can start to rotate. You can see here how the pyramid pattern is starting to rotate based on the slope value of our background. So again, we'll set this to something closer to 0. This is what we get. And then if we want to rotate these again based on that background input slope, this is the kind of result that we would get from that. Okay, so just scrolling down a little further, you can see that we also have just, kind of some of the traditional settings you would expect, like, mask random, and so on. So that's how the shape splatter works. We also have some outputs here. So the output, or the default output, is going to be this height, and here's what the height map looks like. We also have this splatter data 1 and splatter data 2. And this is going to give us, here, let's double click and take a look at splatter data 2. Let me just turn off the alpha. And so what this is going to do here, if we take a look at this, this is going to give us data in texture space. And this data can be used with the flood fill companion filters. So here you can see that we have RGBA for each channel. R is going to represent, like I said, UV data here. So red channel is going to represent UV.X. The green channel is going to represent UV.Y. B and A is going to be the B box width and height, and so on. And like I said, we can use these with the flood fill companion filters. Here with splatter data 1, you can see that the red channel is going to give us a pattern ID. And a little bit later in the video, I'm going to show you how we can use these outputs. So like I said, that's the shape splatter node and how it works. Let's take a look at another little example here. So like I said before, maybe we want to do something like have some sticks, and we want to conform those. We want to first replicate those and then kind of conform those to this underlying height information that we have. So I'm just going to drag and drop this base material in here, and let's take a look at this guy. Let's move my light around so we can more clearly see this. So here's an example where I have some really simple shapes to make, what I'm calling here a stick. It's not very great or anything, but just for demo purposes, it'll get the point across. So here we have our background, and in this particular case, you can see that I'm taking a levels, just running a levels here and taking the output white and lowering that, which has the result of lowering the value of my background height. So in this case, I'm controlling it using this value here. And again, if I check my info, I can sample these areas and I can look at the values. And since I'm coming up with my own scale, and let's say that I want to make something like that 100 units represents maybe 100 meters or something like that, then I can come up with a relation of what these values, these grayscale values, mean in terms of scale. And so here I'm using my levels to do that. So now, here we'll get rid of that info, and like I said, I have my little shapes here that represent a stick, I guess we could say. And then here I have my levels, and again, I'm doing the same thing where I'm adjusting the height value based on how I'm processing that value through this levels command. Then I'm running that here through my shape splatter. And if we look at the parameters, we'll scroll down. And if we look at our height offset, you can see here that here I'm using this conform to background, and I have this set to 1, so that again, that I can have these sticks just kind of follow along with the underlying height map that I have. So another example of this would be maybe rocks. So here I did the same thing, except just using some rocks, and I'm just kind of scattering these guys, again, using or making sure that I have my conform to background here set all the way up here to 1. Oh, in this case, I don't actually have it. So we'll come in here, and again, we'll just set this here to be conform background to 1. Okay, so now, again, these rocks are, following the terrain here a bit better. Okay, so another thing that you can do with this is you can start to kind of chain these guys together. So here I have this example where I have my terrain. This is this purlin. And then, like I said, I have my two patterns, these rock shapes. And this is the height map that I'm outputting here. And then I am taking another shape splatter. So for the background height, I'm using the background, that purlin noise and the rocks. And then for my pattern here, I'm just using those sticks. And so now let's take a look at the result of this operation here with the shape splatter. Bring this guy in, and now this is kind of what we're getting. And what's really awesome about this is that, again, because the sticks are being placed on top of these rocks, and again, if I come back, I'm just using that same setting here where I'm using conform to background. The sticks are basically, laying on top of the rocks. So we have our background ground plane, and we have our rocks, which are conforming to the slope of that ground plane. Then we're layering some sticks on top of that, and the sticks are now conforming to its background height, which is our Perlin noise and our rocks. And this is the type of result that we get where we have these sticks kind of laying on top of the rocks. You had to, it was a pain to try to get something like that to work out, and there was a lot of tricks you had to try to do. But now using the shape splatter, we can get that result really quickly with a lot of flexibility here with the parameters that we have. All right, so like I said earlier, we also have this splatter data. So let's take a look at how that works. So what we're going to do is let's come all the way back up here in this example, and let's take a look at our good old pyramids again. And this time we'll come back to our shape splatter, and I'm going to go to my pattern input, and I'm just going to set this to 2. So now we have 2 types of patterns. We have, again, like I said, the pyramid, and then we have this hemisphere. And so now I'd like to use some of this splatter data. So like I said, you can use this with the flood fill companion nodes, but we also created a node to go along with this shape splatter. So here I'm going to hit the space bar, and I'll start to do a search for shape, and you'll see here that we have the new shape splatter, and then we have this shape splatter blend and shape splatter blend color. So, blend is just grayscale, and color as well for color operations. Let's work with the color. So I'm going to make an instance here in my graph of this shape splatter blend color. All right, so we need to start to hook this guy up. So I'm going to take my splatter data 1 and plug this into the input, and splatter data 2 and plug that into the data 2 input here for the blend. So now we need to start to add some more inputs. We need to set up a background color and a pattern. So for the background color, I'm just going to make a uniform color here, and let's just set a value. We'll just do maybe something like this, I guess. This will work. And then we'll plug this here into the background color. Okay, and then so we can visualize this. What I'm actually doing here is I'm going to be creating a base color that I can use. And so I can visualize that here in my 3D view. Let's just create another base material node really quickly here. So we'll do base material. And let's come into here and let's enable our color map and normal and height and ambient occlusion. And I'm going to set here my metallic here to 0 and my roughness to a high roughness value. All right, so what we're going to do is we're going to plug in this base color, and I already have computed my normal map here from my sample, so let's plug that guy in. Here's my ambient occlusion, we'll plug that in, and then finally we need our height, which is going to be coming from our shape splatter, the kind of default output, and we'll plug this guy in. All right, so let's visualize what we have here. So right click the base material, we'll drag and drop that here into our view, and we're getting something like this. Well, like I said, this shape splatter blend is going to be creating our color map, and we've set a background color. Well, I can see that background color on our terrain example here, but we need to colorize our pattern now. So just to show this, let's make a checker here. So we'll create a checker, and I'm going to create a gradient to colorize this guy. So we'll plug this into the gradient map. Let's come over here to our gradient editor, left click here to make a key, and I'm just going to set this to like a red. So now we have this red and white checker, and I'm going to plug that here into my pattern. So now when I do that, actually let's take our scaling back as well. So we'll take this to maybe something like, we'll do this 3. So now you can see here, and if I go back, let's see, to my shape splatter node, again, if I look at the data from this, you can see that this is giving me a pattern ID, a pattern index, and so on. And I'm using that so that I can basically kind of texture map these shapes that I have with a pattern, which is this pattern 1. And right now, since I'm only using the pattern 1, this checker pattern is being applied to all the shapes. And then we have this background color, which is being applied to that background height, which was our Perlin noise. So since we have 2 patterns, let's come over here to the shape splatter, and let's increase our pattern number here to 2. So now you can see that this is starting to isolate because it knows, based on the splatter data, it knows the index of each of these patterns. So now let's make another pattern. Let's see here. Let's grab something like, I guess I'll just grab the Perlin noise again. And maybe we'll adjust our scale down to something like this. And since we're working with color, I'm going to colorize this grayscale noise here, just using the gradient editor. We'll make a key, and we'll make this like a blue here. And now let's put this into pattern 2. And so now we're basically setting pattern 2 to texture map with this particular Perlin noise, and pattern 1 is being texture mapped with this colorized gradient. So now we get something like this here. And this gives us a way, this blend node, whoops, let me just select these guys. This gives us a way to colorize our patterns. Again, this is just a way that this particular blend node is using the pattern, the splatter data that we are able to output from the splatter node. Now, there's one other input here which is pretty cool, which is this color input. And this guy here allows us to colorize all the patterns. So what we're going to do is let's create another color map we can use. Now, in this case here, actually, I think I'm going to do, let me search for polygon. I'm going to use this polygon here. And I'll just increase the sides a bit so we get something like this. And then we're going to colorize this guy as a gradient. And we'll open up our gradient editor. And let's come into here and just start to make, here, we'll set this first key here to green, if I can do that. There we go. And then we'll come in here, we'll set the last key here to like red. And then right here in the middle, let's create a middle key and set it to something like a yellow. So we'll make this into like a heat map, I guess. So now this is the map that we have. We're going to use this as our color input. So I'm going to connect this into the color input. Well, we don't see anything yet, and that's because we have this color input opacity setting, and I need to make sure that I set this all the way up here to 1. So now when I do that, you can see that now we're colorizing everything based on this color input. So to get a better idea of this, let's go back here to our shape splatter node. And let's increase our X and Y amount to a pretty high value, something like this. And now we're getting this kind of result, which is, again, pretty cool. And we can also come back here to this shape splatter blend, and we can start to adjust things like maybe our hue saturation, the luminance value. We'll do this randomly. So let's take our luminance and increase this randomly, and now we'll get a result something like this. Or we could also come in and start to play around with our hue and so on. Now we get this type of pattern. So it's a lot of fun to play with. It's really cool. And again, we can always go back here to our gradient. Here, let's do this. So let's take this hue back down to 0 here. And we'll go back to our gradient. And we can start to just kind of play around with our gradient here to get different results. Let's plot another key in here and move this guy like this. So using this shape splatter blend node, it just gives us a way to use the data that's coming out of the shape splatter to do things like colorize these different patterns in various ways. And like I said earlier, if I hit the space bar here and we go to look at flood fill, we can also use these companion filters with the shape splatter data as well, just like we were able to do with the original flood fill. All right, so that's going to close out this video on the new shape splatter node. In this video, we discussed how the node works. We discussed the importance of being able to use the node based on a real-world scale, that we can output specific data that can be used with the utility flood fill nodes, and we also showcased another companion node to the splatter, which is this shape splatter blend. So thanks a lot for watching, and I'll see you next time.